Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
Hey, I saw some very incredible pictures from New York's Spring Fashion Week a little while ago. Like some seriously impressive outfits. Tom Brown's collection, inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Did you check this out? So it's sort of like architecture rather than clothing. And Brown had actress Carrie Coon from the Gilded Age narrate the poem as the models were walking down the runway. Very impressive.
Are actually talking to me about Fashion Week? I would not have thought that you would be into that kind of thing. You are, I don't know, it's like one podcast episode taping, you're wearing a blue shirt, and then the other podcast taping, you're wearing like a different blue shirt.
That's right. I
Um,
have lots of blue shirts. Did I read that? Like it sound like I really actually did any of those things that I said that I did there? Because really what I've been doing is playing Madden and going to soccer tournaments. So I'm not typically somebody who thinks a lot about style, the way, especially the way that it appears on television. And yet it's very important in literature. I think about it all the time when I'm writing. And I do think that fashion is a kind of art, and the way that people dress themselves can be a kind of personal art.
Hey, I'm the choir on this because as long as there have been clothes, they've mattered. They're signifiers of like class and personality and community. And how they're manufactured is, of course, like very, very tied to global economic issues. And Fashion Week is often where conversations about design and clothes and trends begin. Like, what do we think is beautiful and appealing to us at this moment? And how does that get back to, say, the mall? So to discuss all of that, um, this week, we're joined by my good friend, Sally Franson, who is here to help your incredibly well-dressed and stylish F&F co-hosts explore the world of fashion and how it's depicted in literature and on film. Sally Franson is the author of the novel A Lady's Guide to Selling Out. Her second novel, Big in Sweden, will be published this summer by Mariner Books. Sally was a 2022 cast member of Allt för Sverige, a Swedish reality TV show about finding your roots. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Best American Travel Writing, and on NPR, among other places. And she lives in Minneapolis. Lucky for me. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
So I understand from Sugi inviting yet another city neighbor on to the podcast, that you used to work, you worked in fashion in New York and London when you were younger. Can you talk a little bit about that and your history with the fashion industry? What jobs did you have, and what did you learn about fashion when you were doing them?
Yes, it seems like another lifetime ago, but in the early 2000s, when I was a student at Barnard, I had an internship at what was then a very cool startup called Daily Candy. And Daily Candy was one of the kind of what Web 1.0 disruptors of the fashion industry. This is pre-fashion blogs, where instead of only the big mastheads, Elle, Vogue, kind of controlling who was learning what in the industry or women's wear daily. Daily Candy was like your cool best friend who would send an email once a day and be like, oh, there's a sample sale happening on Christopher Street tomorrow. You can come. Or this indie designer is selling her bags at a trunk show at this boutique in Soho. And so it was at that time very cool and was then bought by Comcast and became much less cool. But I was there in its heyday, 2005 to 2006 as an intern. And so my jobs were, as you might imagine, mostly unglamorous, proofreading copy, going through the massive amount of swag that came in the mail. I mean, I think I literally didn't buy lipstick for years afterwards because I just like kept taking samples and galleys of books too. They would cover books as well. I also got to do some cool stuff where they did at that time regular features for the Today Show, kind of bringing New York fashion to the masses. So I would go to H&M and other places like that, pull clothes for spring styles or summer styles. And then occasionally do interviews with people in the industry as well. So the cool thing about that was that I got to go to fashion shows. I went to in the spring of 2006 to the fall of 2006. Fashion Week, because they're always a season ahead. And then I parlayed that when I moved to London briefly after college, and I worked for an indie designer who showed her clothes out of Spitalfields Market. So if you've heard of that, it's now very much a tourist attraction. But again, when I was there in the early 2000s, it was a place for really edgy, young, interesting designers to peddle their wares. So my job was to wear the clothes and then sell the clothes. And there were these beautiful wool suits to passersby. And I kept the clothes for years, and I finally gave them away because they didn't fit anymore. so so that was my trip into the fashion world. And for a long time I eschewed that history because it felt like I couldn't be taken seriously as a writer unless I was only thinking about matters of the mind. But of course, after reading Henry James and Edith Wharton, I realized, oh, how people present themselves is a huge part of writing fiction, and a huge part of understanding characters and personalities as well.
So, Sally, I have a couple questions. First of all, number one, Whitney, do you know what a sample sale is?
I think it's where you sell samples of things of fashion, right? I don't know.
Sally, is Whitney correct?
More or less.
Yeah.
It's
See?
yeah, I would say more or less. Designers will make samples in very specific sizes to say, oh, is this working on our models? Or can we bring this to wholesalers and get them to sign on so that they can sell them retail? But they'll often have overstock of these samples, or maybe they've been lightly worn. And so I remember Autumn Cashmere is a cashmere company, and they, I think, were the first sample sale I ever went to. And I got my very first cashmere sweater. It was tomato red, and it had leather elbow patches. And I think I got it for maybe $60 or something like that. And I wore it into the ground. I mean, I think I just got rid of it a few years ago. I was stitching up the hems, like it was falling apart, but I had this real sentimental attachment to my first cashmere sweater. So yeah, sample sales are really fun, and they don't happen in Minneapolis, unfortunately.
So I've been sad to realize that, because like I did have the few years when I lived in New York, and I had, of course, more stylish friends like you, and people who knew what sample sales were. And I, like, when you sort of, like, I had a sense probably of what they were. I was like, oh, it's a trunk show. And I would have these friends who would sort of be like, meet me on this block. And they perhaps were also the sort of friends who would have known how to apply for a job in fashion. And so I'm curious, how do you apply for a job in fashion? Because, like, how do you dress for that job interview? Like, what
Oh,
even, I mean, I think I can't, I would be like Andy or whatever in The Devil Wears Prada, and I would show up sort of like, I don't know, like, I'm good at buying stuff, but often not good at wearing it. Um,
oh my gosh. Okay, well, so how did I get the job? How everyone gets jobs in fashion, nepotism. My friend was working at a record label on the Lower East Side, and the guy who ran the record label's girlfriend was an editor at Daily Candy. And so I got set up via that. And I think really that's how, at least at that time, I think it is changing. It was very much a industry of nepotism. And I was very nervous when I went to the interview. That I planned my outfit, days in advance, and there were these brown riding boots that I had gotten. What's that really famous thrift store in Williamsburg? It's still around. I
I have
want to
no idea.
say, oh my gosh, it's massive. I mean, I'm gonna be embarrassed. I forgot it. So I wore those, and then skinny jeans, which were new at the time. And they were designer skinny jeans, black jeans, and then a vintage sweater. And I guess I passed muster. And then when I got the job, I treated myself to Tasty Delight, if you remember what that is, a very specific New York early 2000s reference.
So we've talked a couple of times here about Fashion Week, and that's really the time peg for this episode. And I wonder, for our listeners who might not know why Fashion Week matters, can you talk a little bit about how industry insiders regard it, and kind of, like, as someone who cares about fashion, what events you follow? Because I feel like my social media stream is sort of full of like dresses from the Oscars, Emma Stone's fashion mishap where her dress tore, um, and
Well,
people
the
who,
fashion weeks are Paris and New York, right? I mean, those are the major ones, but are there other ones that are important?
And they're actually, yes, and they all have specific reputations. So New York
Okay.
Fashion Week, for a long time, New York was kind of the upstart and was, being dying to be taken seriously. And so people like Ralph Lauren, Tommy Hilfiger sort of were like, no, we have, and Oscar de la Renta were like, oh no, you should. New York is also a destination, not just Paris and Milan. And now with people like Tom Ford and Marc Jacobs, like, you know, New York Fashion Week is quite a thing. London Fashion Week is also a thing. And London Fashion Week has a reputation, at least when I was paying more attention, of being edgier. And you have, Alexander McQueen and really amazing houses there now that have maybe more of a bite to them. And also on the up and coming, which is near and dear to my heart as someone with Swedish heritage, is Copenhagen Fashion Week.
Oh,
Scandi style is quite a thing. So Paris and Milan are, the classics with all of the great old houses, but there are plenty of other cities in the mix as
and
well. And the reason,
Paris
oh,
already
go ahead.
happened, right? That was earlier in February. And is Milan
Yes,
at the same time? Okay.
yes, they're all like, it's a month, and basically all the editors and buyers are going from one to the other,
Okay.
which sounds exhausting, but also a lot of fun. And the reason that they're fun is the same way that like the London Book Festival is fun, or the Frankfurt Book Festival. They're trade shows. It's to get people excited about the new things, coming out the following season, and create buzz. And the reason it matters, sort of, for Main Street or whatever, is that these styles trickle down, especially with places like Prada, like the chunky platform loafer. You're seeing those now, the Gen Z's wearing them. And those kind of came back in the vanguard several years ago. So it's everything that you're seeing in fashion outlets or in malls or, places like JQ or whatever, they're mimicking things that happened several seasons ago, which is, I used to have kind of like my Midwestern anti-snobbery, which is, why would you pay, so much money for these clothes? And, part of it is the materials, and you're actually paying people a living wage to make them, especially in these old houses in France and in Italy. But that these are people's new ideas. These designers are envisioning something as opposed to just copying.
So I'll
Sugi,
just add that while I was researching this episode, I did not realize that New York Fashion Week happens twice a year. And now I know. So you can look forward to it in the fall again. Sorry, Whitney, you were saying?
That's true.
the really interesting thing about some of the collections that were out this year is that some high profile designers use literature as an influence for their collections. Actually, it makes perfect sense to me, but I guess it's not that surprising. And it's one of the reasons that we're doing the episode. This includes the French designer, Louis Gabriel Nucci, their summer 2024 collection based on Christopher Isherwood's A Single Man, and Anna Sui's fall 2024 seems like collection. It seems like it's linked to Agatha Christie. And of course, the writer Joan Didion has become a writer and fashion icon. Um, is literature often as an inspiration for fashion or vice versa? And what kind of conversation or brand signifying is going on here when these designers want to pick out these writers to refer to with their work?
I think this is such an interesting question, and it's one that I've been mulling over for at least a decade, because it seems, we're such an image-driven culture now. We're not a text-based culture, but the way that literature or people who are interested in literature are interested in taste associated with literature is you can co-opt
Yeah.
images of authors and of books and say, and then that becomes sort of a tribal affiliation or brand recognition. And so the Joan Didion becoming such a internet, you see her image all over, Instagram, for example, or at least I do, the picture of her in the car or smoking, looking out the window. And one can attach to that image of a writer or images of her books without actually ever encountering the books. And I'm no Joan Didion stan. I'm sort of neutral on Joan Didion, which I feel like is kind of rare. But that it equally galls me, if I'm in a judgmental mode, or it just fascinates me. And I think the same could be true for James Baldwin. And James Baldwin is someone who had really amazing style. I mean, that man could dress, and I think he took pride in it. And he had what you can't buy, right? He had taste. Like he was doing interesting things with scarves and polo shirts. He was wearing Izod. He would buy them secondhand. Um, and then there, if you Google James Baldwin fashion, you know, there are people writing breathlessly about him in GQ. But I think for someone like James Baldwin, and I think Joan Didion too, you know, the taste and the style was an outcome of the mind. You know, the mind was doing interesting things and had a rich interior. And so of course that led to a rich exterior in those cases. And I think in our culture now, we're kind of like, who cares about the interior? You know, like let's just look like Joan Didion. And so I think that fashion and literature have, you know, always been in conversation, and there are so many books I can think of um, where you know characters are known via their clothes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
wanted to bring in this idea though of like literature or a writer's work being captured by commercial culture and reprocessed as a brand, right? There's a very interesting essay by Donald Barthelme called On Not Knowing, where he talks about the reason that he writes experimentally was to try to avoid that, to make it really hard for anyone to want to like take his work and make a
Package him.
fashion show based on it because it's too hard to understand. You know, but he
I
talks
feel
about
like
that's
he
the
succeeded at that. I think he did a
yes,
good
he's
job
done that.
at
There's
that.
no Donald Barthelme collections out, you know. Although he was very interested in the visual arts, and he was an art. He directed a an art museum in Houston for a certain amount of time in his career, right? So he cared about visual arts, but he didn't care about. He didn't want to be commercialized in that way. I guess that seems like what you're talking about here.
Right. I think that the thing is, I don't think that anyone who considers themselves an artist, or a lot of people are, you know, maybe don't want to be commercialized. And at the same time, you know, the royal we, need cash flow. So an example that comes to mind is that the New York Review of Books just, I think last year, did a collaboration with the designer Rachel Comey, where you could buy, you know, these, I think maybe $500+ dresses that were actually printed with actual editions of the New York Review of Books. So in one way, I applaud the New York Review of Books. I feel like they probably have a relatively small audience. You know, they want that audience to grow. It has, right, a good brand. It's known as, you know, and I'm using air quotes here, it's known as a place where, you know, intellectuals go to read. But now you don't even have to read it. It's too big, it's unwieldy, and you could just have a tote bag, right, with the cover instead, or have a dress with it on instead. So, you know, that tension between art and commerce is, I don't know if it's ever, well, I shouldn't say that. It feels very fraught right now because of how the economics of at least American society is structured.
I also feel that there are some artists who are like more enthusiastic about commercializing their work than others. I mean, writers. I mean, you know, like if you think like I feel like Ernest Hemingway would have been perfectly fine with an Ernest Hemingway collection line of whatever, you know, pants he used to wear. And there is, in fact, like a furniture line based on his, like, he was fine with that. That would have been cool with him, you know. But then there are others who are not interested in that. And then the people like Joan Didion or James Baldwin, they don't have a say in it. They're, you know, they can't participate. Their image is being taken and their sort of style, but that's not really, they're not around to manage it.
Yeah, and I it's complicated for me, especially with someone like James Baldwin, whose work has meant a lot to me. I'm not trying to corner the market on loving James Baldwin at all, but he was such a radical person, and such a, he seemed to be really living from the inside out, you know, and we would use the term authenticity, you know, when speaking about James Baldwin's brand, which is totally disgusting to think about him as a brand. But it troubles me that humans are products now. You know, it really troubles me, especially when, you know, I think he lived his life um, uh, working so much against, you know, dominant mainstream trends, and this one has kind of swept, you know, the person becoming product has swept him up, and Joan Didion too.
There's this interesting line between sort of like, right, when you're presenting yourself to others, like, how are you caring about and perceiving yourself? And then to what extent are you even willing to present yourself to others? And I was just thinking about, as you were talking about, right, what it means to pay money for clothes. Like fast fashion is a thing, particularly in the United States. And I should say, like, like for a long time, for years, like my parents and I would, I love shopping with my mother. And like we would go to stores and we'd pick up shirts and then we'd look at the labels and be like, odds on made in Sri Lanka. And the odds on made in
Hmm.
Sri Lanka are very, very high. They're very high. This is cheap to make clothes overseas, and Americans are buying a lot of clothes. I have an absurd amount of clothes. And there's actually, right, this is also like an environmental problem because like as we buy these clothes, there's kind of like when you get rid of your clothes, if you clean out your closet to like make way for the new season, what do you do with that? There's kind of not really a good way to refresh. And like at the same time that there's now this profusion of clothes that are not made very well. And I'm working my way here towards an analogy that I think is like potentially not going to work. But
When
like
are you going to
there's
get there?
where there's also we're also at this moment when more books are being published than ever before. And I would argue that a lot of those books are good. That like now there's more space for good literature, but there is also like this narrative of, oh, kind of like now the market is glutted. There's so many things. There's no gatekeeping. Like there's too much stuff. It's too accessible. Like anyone can write these days, which is also not true. And um, I don't know, like this kind of sense of like abundance and cost that is causing us to value things in certain ways and perceive them as signifiers of taste or not. And I wonder like what you think about my slightly messy analogy and if it works.
I think there's definitely something to it. I mean, the proliferation of fast fashion has, I think there's something to do with income inequality. There's something to do with, rampant consumer culture, and then also our profound American belief in trash. Right? When if you don't, buy something, don't like it, throw it away. Where again, I feel like it's the exterior that has meaning. So if you can buy something cheap, but that's trendy, or maybe is going to have a tribal affiliation, it doesn't matter if it's going to fall apart in the wash, right? Because you kind of got that hit of dopamine of belonging and having an exterior that lined up with the zeitgeist. And yeah, that's really troubling to me. I will say that if you have clothes to get rid of and they're not able to give away, H&M does do fabric recycling. So I always bring
Oh.
my clothes, or like underwear, socks, things like that. They'll make insulation and stuff from them. Um, uh, and then, I mean, I think the gatekeep, though there's no gatekeepers anymore. I mean, I would say, at least in publishing, it feels like there's a lot of gatekeeping. I
Yeah.
mean, it's hard to publish books, I think, or it's hard for me. It's hard to write books. Um, but it does seem like more is more is more is more in terms of acquisition and making. And I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what that means in terms of the value of an object. And I was thinking about it because I just recently bought a hardcover, a brand new hardcover, and I thought, damn, this feels so good in my hands. Like this feels nice. I'm glad I paid $30 for this, or whatever. And certainly when I was younger, I was just like Amazon paperback or Abe Books, used, fine quality. I didn't really care as much about how it felt or the physical experience of it. And now I care a lot more. Maybe it's because I'm getting older, or I'm more concerned with waste.
So we've been talking about a lot of authors. You've dropped some interesting hints about what your taste in this regard might be. But so I'm curious about what your favorite novels incorporating like great clothing descriptions or style are. When we talked about this before, I was kind of like, The Devil Wears Prada is like a very obvious recent reference, and of course, like the ugly duckling to beautiful swan arc is kind of a classic. Um, Maybe particularly in teen movies. But you and I had a conversation that ran a more exciting gamut from Evelyn Waugh and Nancy Mitford to Bridget Jones' Diary, and you had a really interesting argument about that book. So I wonder if you can take us from the former to the latter and explain why those books are iconic depictions of fashion.
I'm going to take you from the former to the latter, but first I'm going to go back even earlier, because I feel like we can't talk about fashion and literature unless we're talking about Henry James. I think that Isabel Archer's sartorial arc in a Portrait of a Lady is so important. She arrives fresh from Albany, New York, into Britain, and I think she's wearing a white garden dress. And she's flush and hopeful and youthful, and she has everything on her side. And then she comes into this windfall of money. She can have beautiful clothes made for her, and then she marries the wrong dude and moves to Italy and becomes increasingly Europeanized, and her clothes become darker and more constricting, and and the severity of her clothes and the kind of restrictions of her clothes, I think, really mirror the restrictions of her life. And then I want to kind of go parallel to that because I think Natasha in War and Peace also has an amazing sartorial arc. She's a we meet her as a little girl. She's adorable. She's skipping around in a frilly dress. She becomes a beautiful young woman, and then by the end, Tolstoy's greatest imagining for her is that she's plump and wearing a sack and has like so many kids that she's taking care of and no longer cares about such things. And then we have Edith Wharton, right, chronicling the Gilded Age and the presentation of selfhood. And we have Lily Bart, going from very fine clothes to wearing rags and dying alone in a hotel room. But the between war years in Britain is some of my favorite, some of my very, very favorite books, including books by Evelyn Waugh, Nancy Mitford. Nancy Mitford is one of my patron saints. And the descriptions of the debutante ball clothes, also the hunting clothes, what you wear to dinner when you go to a manor house on the weekend. Oh my gosh, I could just gobble up those descriptions all day. They are so pleasurable to read. And I think that attention to class and clothes, you can actually trace that arc all the way to the mid 90s when we meet my other patrons, Bridget Jones, in Bridget Jones's diary. And Bridget Jones's clothes are routinely used for farce, right? So you might remember the iconic scene in the movie where she goes down the fireman's pole when she becomes a reporter, and she exposes her granny panties and thick black tights to the public because she's not thinking about what she's wearing. There's the classic Tarts and Vickers party. And then there's all the underpants that she's struggling into so she can go on various dates and fail. And I think the way that clothing is used, that Helen Fielding uses clothes in Bridget Jones's diary, goes to show kind of how linked they are to selfhood and how at ease we are in the world or ill at ease in the world, right? We know that Bridget Jones is trying to both draw attention to and become some slightly different version of herself, where she's showing up in low-cut blouse and mini skirts to her office. And then when she's hanging out with her friends, drinking wine at home, she's got her sweatpants on, her pajamas. And safety, comfort versus performance, constriction is how Fielding uses clothes to great comic effect in that case. And I told Sugi earlier, I think that Bridget Jones's Diary is my Alamo. I will die on the hill of that book any day of the week.
It's really interesting the way that you talk about the way fashion works in literature, particularly that earlier literature, and like James or Evelyn Waugh, because in that case, the reporter is trying to figure out something about a society that is taking its cues for fashion from somewhere else, not reflexively back from literature, right? As we were talking about earlier, right? So in this case, Henry James is thinking about fashion as a way of thinking about the way that America is influenced by Europe, correct? Right? And that's
Yes,
what that is about, right? And
yes,
so
yeah.
the writer is, there's a reporter talking about a society that is taking its cues and doesn't even know that the writer exists or cares what they're wearing. Like they're not important enough to be noticed, right? But they're trying to talk about a world, right? And get it across to the reader who isn't a part of that world, partly through the clothing.
Yes, I think that's a great way to think about it. If one of the questions that a novel can do is, what is it like to be alive right now at the time of this book's telling? What people are wearing and how they're wearing it is a huge kind of window into a society that you might not understand. And I think that's why in Nancy Mitford, Evelyn Waugh, when they're doing all the changing, right, where they might have, I'm thinking of, I can't remember which of Waugh's books, but they're having tea at 4 or 5, and then they're changing for dinner and going out at 10 and 11. I mean, that just kind of blew my mind. I was like, you're getting into nice clothes that late at night? Like, I think, I lost the thread of what you were saying, Whitney.
Well, it's about the fact that these writers are describing social groups that are getting their fashion cues from somewhere else, not from writers, like as we were talking about the way that Baldwin and Joe Didion's fashion is being imitated now. Like the writers are reporting on a world that's separate from them, and that they're trying to tell the reader about it through the fashions, and that the fashion of this particular group of people tells us about how they live and work and what they believe in, really.
And like you said earlier, that how America, fashion and otherwise, is influenced by Europe, and how
Yeah.
Europe is then influenced by America, particularly American money, right? Because Isabel may not bring sophistication with her when she comes into her fortune, but she's certainly bringing cash that is going to aid in the accumulation of more stuff for this failing, semi-broke European aristocratic family.
And so in some
I
ways,
mean,
I mean,
that
I think
was,
what you're talking about is the way that clothes signify old money and new money. Um, or
Absolutely.
people's perceptions about it, right? I think also of, I remember as a kid reading God forbid Gone with the Wind, right? And like Rhett Butler is like, some of it's about like trade, right? If like he brings her stuff from Paris because he has access, because he's traveling, and there are sort of ships coming in or whatever, like the person who's the fanciest is getting the thing from the farthest away, which maybe is Europe. And then but then there's something quite gauche about being the person who like admits to having the money, like this moment maybe when America's of course thoroughly engaged in capitalism, but there is some performance of shame about being engaged in it, at the same time. And I don't know, just to throw another couple of references in there, I think that as I was reading, like I was kind of going and refreshing my memory a little bit about descriptions I really loved, and there's some beautiful writing about clothing in Anna Karenina, and like a couple of people flagged Jane Eyre, and then I went back and looked at that, and you think of, right, Jane Eyre is of course like little and plain, et cetera, et cetera, and then also kind of like at the moment that she comes into her own, wears color,
Hmm.
and it's kind of, so I mean it's very simple and kind of painterly, and in your head like a description like that lights up, and becomes immediately memorable.
I
Who
um
would you, do you have a fashion person? If you had to pick somebody from literature, that you would wear or imitate their clothing for a week. Sugi likes Anne of Green Gables,
that was not
the
my
brown dress with the
answer.
puffy sleeves. But I'm asking Sally, if she had to pick someone, who would that be?
Oh gosh, I think that I would probably, because I've read so much about Nancy Mitford, I've read her over, but I've also read about her life. I would pick Nancy Mitford during her Parisian days, because she came from an aristocratic family and then was doing quite well for herself with her books, and I think was dating a count for a while. I think she dressed real well. I don't think I'd want, she had a pretty difficult life, but I would like her clothes. I would also go back. I'd skip around like Jo March during her, not when she's running a school with the old German man, but like when she was an ingenue. I'd run around in comfy Jo March clothes. She was doing it differently. What about you, Sugi?
That's funny because I remember when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, there's a moment where Meg kind of goes to a dance and like
Yeah.
dresses like not herself, and Laurie sort of comes and shames her for it.
Yes.
He's
And I was
secretly like a little bit of stinker.
and Amy gets her clothes from Paris when she and Laurie get married. That's a big thing.
Yeah, and Amy's the one with taste. I think I there's a Sri Lankan Canadian writer I really, whose work I love and was just formative for me. Sham Selvathur, and his He wrote a novel called Cinnamon Gardens, in which my like secret guilty pleasure of reading this novel. I mean, he's just a very fine writer, but like that novel has a profusion of clothing descriptions, just like these fantastic saris and jewelry sets, which are like in
Mm.
this particular historical period where Sri Lanka is undergoing this political change. And I met him at a conference, and kind of my horror, and then to my delighted surprise, I was like, Sham, I really love the outfits in Cinnamon Gardens. And then I was like, oh my God, what did I just say? And then he was like, oh my God, thank you. I like did all this, and then we had this great conversation about clothes. And I think I would want to wear the clothes of the heroine in that book, which are so gorgeous. So Whitney, what are you wearing in this dream world where we get to wear the clothes of our literary heroes?
I'm not the right person to ask. I just want to wear the same thing every day. That's like that, this is what I would wear, what I have on. Like just a t-shirt and like this sort of jersey and a pair of jeans. I'm good. That's it.
Well,
Is there a, is
Anna
there a
Wintour
is there
wears
a
a
fashion
uniform.
person who wears that?
Anna Wintour, lots of people wear
Okay,
uniforms.
good for
Um,
her. I
so
would
you
go with
are
that.
taking your cue from style icons, I guess. So Sally, I want to pivot to talk about how you write about style in your fiction. Your first novel, A Lady's Guide to Selling Out, has just been reissued in paperback. Tune into YouTube to see me holding the gorgeous hot pink hardback. Sally was ahead of the Barbie core trend. Everyone should know. And your protagonist, Casey, works in advertising and marketing, and she has an eye for design and image, like if she's wearing a pencil skirt, like there's a reference to that in the scene, or just she has a knack for it. And there's a scene in which she's reflecting on an embarrassing event from her past involving slam poetry that really capitalizes on clothing descriptions. And I wonder if you would read that for us.
It would be my pleasure. So there's not much context you need to know for this scene, except that Casey, the main character, has been out of college, I think, for 5 years, and her best friend from college, Susan, is going in a different direction. So she can feel the two of them moving apart, and it scares her. All these years later, Susan wouldn't let me live down the 3 months my junior year when I convinced myself I was a slam poet. As part of the English major, we were required to take a creative writing class. I'd chosen poetry because it seemed easiest. The professor, who insisted the class call him Jay, commuted in from New York City and spoke with a lot of pregnant pauses. A few years before, he'd had a part in Def Poetry Jam, which he mentioned several times on the first day of class while wearing a t-shirt that said, "Eat the Rich." That same day, he'd made us write and perform our first poem. Mine, inspired by his t-shirt, was about rich people not picking up dog poop. Jay seemed to like it. He snapped his fingers, which I later learned was called a poet snap. He said, "Man, I dig it." Pretty soon, I was saying I dug stuff, and had harnessed the power of my own poet snap. College was an impressionable time for me, what can I say? Or was I always this prone to suggestion? In any case, I bought a pair of Chuck Taylors and developed what I believed to be a socialist aspect. I wrote poems about my father and the effect of media on body image. I believed they were very good. Then I saw the video one of my classmates had uploaded to the college intraweb of our end of semester jam. It was, how can I put this, horrifying. Like watching a toddler dance recital, minus the chubby knee charm. "What the hell is this?" I'd said to Susan once I showed it to her. I was furious, I guess because what had happened in my head did not seem to be reflected accurately by reality. "Amateur hour?" Um, Susan had said delicately, "Yes?" I sent a furious instant message to the videographer, demanding he take the video down and throw it out my newsboy cap. 6 years later, I considered myself a recovering slam poet, more than a former slam poet, though if it weren't for slam poetry, I might never have gotten my job. A year later, I'd had my senior exit interview with the college career counselor, and when asked about my favorite classes, I'd mentioned Jay's. The counselor had smiled at me the way you smile at that lady in Thursday Night Zumba who practices moves in the mirror after class. "Hard to make a living from poetry," she'd said from across her cluttered administrator's desk, while behind her wall of books, all variations of "What Color Is Your Parachute" loomed menacingly down at me. But if you enjoyed, it's certainly something you could do on the side. Then she'd asked if I'd ever considered advertising. I had not. Then I did. Perhaps it is not an overstatement that this woman, with her Talbot's blazer, had changed the course of my life. Plus, Susan wrote, free food. Sometimes it made me sad that Susan had to think about things like free food. I was making six figures, I owned my condo, I could afford to eat whatever and whenever I felt like. But I knew there were things about my life that made Susan sad too. We refrain from saying these things out loud because sometimes the sadness we feel when we look at the lives of our friends just shouldn't be articulated. Anyway, I told Susan I was on my way. Before I could think better of it, typed, BTW, what do you know about Ben Dickinson? With my heart in my throat, I pressed send, for once grateful that texting by its very nature forced language to become extremely casual and not, say, love struck and insane. Her response came immediately. Not much, liked his book. No people in town who knew him. Why? Whee! I thought. Tell you in person, I wrote, and chucked my phone in my bag before opening the car door.
Thank you very much. Um, you have a lot of vivid outfit descriptions and style descriptions in the book. Casey's, as mentioned in that reading section, Casey's former English professor wears an Eat the Rich t-shirt, and Susan swaps the band t-shirts and ripped jeans of her youth for a classy black vest and block heels as the novel progresses. So did you base any of these character styles on people you knew, or were you thinking of particular designers?
I was thinking about a area of Minneapolis where I don't live and have never lived, but visited while I was researching the novel, and that's called the North Loop, which they're trying to brand now as NOLO, the Soho of Minneapolis, if you will. And I was interested in the way that people in advertising, I think in particular, like to dress like artists, but can't quite do it, right? Where they're dressing expensively. Uh, and you could
That's like the
say,
people who work at Hallmark here in Kansas City. It's such a mean thing for me to say. Sorry, people at Hallmark.
I think there's something really tragic. This is going to sound really
Oh,
condescending.
yeah. There's a
I
poet
think there's some,
snap there.
I think there's something really tragic about people who are longing to have a rich interior creative life and are unable to do that because they're working 10 plus hours a day at their advertising job. And so that desire gets sublimated into expensive Nikes or long cashmere coats. And so you have sort of the simulacrum of an artist's life because you get to wear jeans to your office. You can wear expensive jeans if you want. You can leave in the middle of the day and, go to a bar and, do whatever, kind of show off your wares. But it's not quite right? Like that's it, and then now they're calling themselves creatives, which I just think is so funny. Well, again, this sounds really mean, but I don't mean it mean. I just mean there's something. I think it must be hard to have a lot of money and be doing something so close to what you maybe want to do, but not quite.
That makes a lot of sense. I should say that I think one of my favorite clothing descriptions in A Lady's Guide to Selling Out has to do with Casey has a romantic interest, Ben, and he wears a midnight blue velvet blazer the day that she meets him. And then there is a bit of a rift, and he does turn up again. And when he turns up again, he is once again wearing the midnight blue velvet blazer, which is just this nice little touch, right? There's something like when you see the person you care about and they are wearing I mean, honestly, it could have been an old ratty t-shirt. But like the fact that it's this like kind of luxe thing. It's a piece of clothing that I associate with him. And yeah, it's a great little touch.
I think about now, now I do it even more so. This book is a few years old, and so I read that and I think, oh, I would, do so many things differently. But I think now about clothes being like a little gift for a reader. Be like, can I make this kind of pleasurable for you to read? Can I have this can I have you have a visceral reaction to this garment? Can I show you something important about this character? Um, so that so that it has sort of a generous reading to it, even if the description maybe is a little bit cutting.
Can we close out by hearing you talk a little bit about your forthcoming novel, Big in Sweden?
Yes, very. Is there any fashion big in Sweden? I think there might be a little. Actually, there is. So my forthcoming novel, Big in Sweden, comes out July 2nd, and it is a fish out of water story about a woman on the brink of midlife who throws everything up in the air to participate in a Swedish reality show about genealogy. She has Swedish heritage and she goes across the pond to find her family and perhaps a new way of being in the world. And actually, I thought a lot about fashion because I spent a lot of time in Sweden, both filming my own reality TV show, but then going back and doing research because Swedes dress, I would say, pretty differently than Americans do. Obviously, there's kind of the fast fashion outlets across the board, but I would say they have a pretty relaxed approach to the gender binary, right? So there are a lot of women, they're kind of wearing baggy suits, a lot of Chelsea boots by both genders. And it doesn't, I would say their fashion is more relaxed and certainly more geared towards being outside because there's a very outdoorsy culture and the weather is pretty bad.
Sally, thanks so much for joining us. Listeners, don't miss A Lady's Guide to Selling Out and her forthcoming book, Big in Sweden, available in your local independent bookstore.
Thanks so much for having me.